A warm welcome from the University of Kent and the Astor Community Theatre to tonight's event, Gavin Esler in conversation with Polly Toynbee. Thank you for buying a ticket to be here this evening. Money raised from ticket sales will go towards supporting the Astor Community Theatre and the Kent Opportunity Fund, which supports students at the University of Kent. We launched the In Conversation series at Kent in 2015 with our Chancellor, Gavin Esler, and since then we've had some fantastic guests, including the film critic, Mark Kermode.
There's a number of questions about the Oscars, and I could sum them up by saying, the Oscars, are they rubbish or not?
Yes.
Right.
Sandy Toksvig, the host of QI and presenter of the Great British Bake Off.
We were invited to have a lunch, a buffet, with Her Majesty the Queen of Denmark. And it turned out, for reasons I can't fathom, that the entire buffet was made of marzipan. The Danes like marzipan, but this was really going a bit mad. So it was food that looked like food, but all, in fact, when you ate into any of it, it was all actually marzipan. So you'd think, oh, sausage roll. No, my mistake, marzipan.
And many others, including Dame Diana Rigg and Brenda Blethyn. All the recordings of previous events are available on YouTube via www.kent.ac.uk/events. This autumn, we have more great guests lined up, including Terry Waite, Francesca Simon and Michael Gove. Tickets are £5 and are available through our website, with proceeds from the sale of tickets going to the Kent Opportunity Fund, which supports students through scholarships, hardship bursaries and grants for student projects. Without further ado, please welcome to the stage Gavin Esler and Polly Toynbee.
Hello and welcome. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be home. And it's also, actually, I said to my wife just before coming here, it's sold out, it's been sold out for ages, and she said, for goodness sake, don't say that, you're beginning to sound like Donald Trump. So, but thank you for being a greatest audience that we've ever had in the world. Yeah, this has been going on for a couple of years since I've been Chancellor of the University of Kent, which is a great honour, and part of it is to say that the university is part of our community, and I hope a great public service. So our guest tonight is one of Britain's best known and much loved journalists. She's not loved by everybody, as we will discuss, as a result of her pretty straightforward views on things from religion and public life to the decline in social services and inequalities in our society. She is, of course, a Guardian columnist. For a time, she worked for the BBC and is also, along with her partner David Walker, a prolific author, most recently of Dismembered, which is a carefully researched assessment of how the state in Britain has been cut away to such an extent that another one of, in the words of another one of my favourite authors, Michael Sandel, it seems that we have turned a market economy into a market society where so many precious parts of our culture are valued in monetary terms rather than the good they do for all of us. So please we welcome Polly Toynbee. We'll get to the books in a moment, Polly. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background, because there are a lot of Toynbees in British public life in the last 100 years. Which one are you and where do you fit into all this?
Well, I come from a long line of people who've been writers, academics, teachers. My great-grandfather was somebody called Gilbert Murray, who was a great classics professor and translator of the great Greek plays. My grandfather was Arnold Toynbee, historian. My father was Philip Toynbee, who was literary critic, writer, poet.
Now, I read about you that you were not particularly academic. You dropped out of Oxford, for example.
I was very rebellious at school and went to a boarding school that I hated and took myself in the sixth form to a comprehensive, which was one of the first comprehensives in London at the time. And by then my family had more or less written me off as being, oh, well, she's the one who's not going to be academic. And then I astounded myself even more than them and got a scholarship to Oxford, which I wasn't expecting at all. By then I'd had a year off in Rhodesia, as was, working for Amnesty International. Which was fascinating work. And I was the only person there representing Amnesty because they kept throwing people out. And eventually I got thrown out as well and expelled from Rhodesia because they more or less expelled everybody from every kind of voluntary organisation or human rights organisation. And I suppose perhaps the sort of the sense of the seriousness of that year rather unsettled me for Oxford, and so I went to Oxford for a year and a half, but I never really got on with it, and I left thinking mistakenly that I wanted to be more part of the real world, and I'd written a novel which had come out while I was at Oxford. It was very bad. Don't look for it. It's almost unavailable, I'm glad to say. And I thought I would like to go and experience more of the real world. I came from a middle-class background. I didn't feel I knew anything about anything. How can you be a writer if you don't know? So I set off working for a number of in factories and places. I worked in a car parts factory in Birmingham. I worked in the Unilever plant at Port Sunlight. I worked in the Lions Cake factory. I joined the Women's Army for a bit. I did a whole lot of different jobs, feeling that I needed to experience life as other people lived it and as I hadn't. And then I ended up writing a book about that experience called The Working Life.
That, to me, because that to me is the core of what I think of is what you do, actually, which is, we can talk about the analysis and we can talk about all that in a minute, but the empathy is something that, why? Because you saw how people live and how difficult it is for some people in our country to live.
I think so, and I think I had such an awareness of my own life of privilege and separateness and awareness. I came from a very left wing, and my family, all the way back as far as I could trace, have been liberals and then Labour. My father was an early communist, though didn't last for very long as a communist. So I came from that tradition that was extremely aware, brought up to be extremely aware of my own privilege. And I felt very ignorant, and I thought, well, how can I set out to be a journalist or a writer if I know so little about other people's lives? And it's also a kind of, you'll know this as a journalist, it's that burning curiosity. It's not just empathy. You really want to know, you want to find out, you want to get in there, you want to see what people's lives are like. I'm very interested in the world of work anyway, and I think it's underreported. We don't know very much about what people actually do in their jobs, how the day works, what's required of them, what the authority structures are. So I became fascinated by the processes of work and what it does to people. And doing manual jobs, you realise how undervalued people are, how very much more intelligent than they are than the work they do, and how little responsibility they're given over the jobs that they do. And what frustrates people most of all is the inability to do their job as well as they could, if only they could manage it for themselves. It's the managers that drive them mad, mostly out of conscientiousness.
And we're going to get questions from the audience in a little while, but we also get some questions that are emailed in and so on. And one question area that a couple of people touched on is essentially the balance between being opinionated, having a view, and the facts, and being able to do your job as a journalist. Now, because you straddle that, don't you? Because you do both.
Well, I do both. I mean, I have been a reporter. I started out as a reporter on The Observer, and then I became a columnist for The Guardian, really because I'd written books which straddle both. When you write a book, you can put much more of yourself in it. But then the shock of going from having a long column in the Guardian Women's page to suddenly being projected into the BBC newsroom, the culture shock of that was extraordinary. It was during the Thatcher days, and I had to be absolutely fireproof. You know, that line you walk where you tell the truth as a BBC reporter without bias, but with a measure of judgment. And that subtle difference between judgment and bias, you can say, this is what I think is happening, this is where I think it's working and not working, and to do it in an unbiased way. And it was quite scary because I was very well aware of a government that was sort of breathing down my neck. Who's this person who's become this new job, social affairs editor at the BBC? Feeling them breathing down my neck, watching every move I made, if I was reporting on the NHS or on social security or on things that are highly politically contentious. And yet I did manage to do it without getting into trouble.
But I was thinking when you said you met so many people doing jobs from Port Sunlight to the Burger Bar and other places who just wanted to get on with their job, that was just the managers stopping them doing it. I thought you were talking about the BBC, actually.
Well, I think it's true, and I bet most of you will have felt this too, that whenever you talk to anybody about what jobs they have, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector, and you ask them about the satisfactions and dissatisfactions of their work, mostly it is that sense of not being able to control it in the way that you want to, not being able to make it work. And you can see where things are going wrong in your organisation. Almost all organisations are dysfunctional. And the more clever people that are working in the organisation, the more dissatisfied they are. I mean, you look at the BBC or the NHS, and they are full of absolutely brilliant people who are more or less unmanageable because they all think they can see exactly how it ought to be managed much better.
You remind me of a friend of mine who worked for the Pentagon, who said, the thing about the Pentagon here in Washington is we feel like 94,000 ants on a log going down the river, and each one of us thinks we're steering. Let's talk about dismembered, because this argument goes right to the heart of many of the things where we are now. Maybe you could just give us a thumbnail sketch of what the book's about.
The book is about the last 7 years of austerity and what it has done to undermine the idea of the state itself. And in fact, these ideas go back much further. They go back sort of 4 decades, go back to the Thatcher era, really, when the culture change came in with the idea that everything the state does represents the very word the state is bad. Everything that's private is good, more effective, more efficient. Markets and competition, even if applied to the public sector, will always make things work better. And this undermining has now become really acute because the austerity that we've had now is far more severe than anything Margaret Thatcher tried to do in terms of cutting back almost every aspect of the public sector. So David Walker and I travelled the country looking where we could at often underreported elements of what the state does and how much it's being undermined, how much it's being shredded, dismembered. For instance, you know, look at environmental health officers. I expect most of you have been out for a meal over the holiday season, and you would just automatically assume, wouldn't you, that somebody had been into that kitchen, checked it, that it was clean, that the food was safe, where the food came from was all from proper certified places. We went and spent some time, we just chose at random, in Huntingdon with environmental health officers there. They, like almost everywhere else, have been cut by a third. The result is they can check the growing numbers of food outlets much less than they ever used to. Food outlets are rated according to risk by category. So category A is highest risk, where they are really worried about a place, they think it's dirty, they think the people running it are not competent or not honest, and should be very regularly inspected. So they still have category A, and they are still inspected as regularly as they should be every 3 months, but all they've done is make very many fewer places category A. And this happens all the way through the system. You tick the box, it looks all right on paper. What's actually happening is very much less. You ask people within the NHS, within social services, they will all tell the same story. People with huge, unmanageable caseloads who can barely manage to do the most basic safety work. We looked at, for instance, looking at the NHS, we looked at something unfashionable, unexciting, you might think, podiatry. You might think, well, feet, that's something you can cut back on, foot clinics.
I think that's the point of podiatry, actually, sometimes.
That's true. And so we went to Southampton and looked at their service there, where they, their podiatry service is commissioned by a number of different clinical commissioning groups that do the commissioning in this insane competition system we have, tendering out system we have now. They are no longer commissioned by most commissioners to do anything but really acute work. It means they no longer do people with what seem like first stages or minor problems with their feet. As we now have soaring numbers of people with diabetes, and diabetes affects the feet very badly because people get numbness in their feet. They get small infections or small injuries that they don't feel because their feet are numb, which very easily and quickly turn into large ulcers and become gangrenous. The result is that they are only dealing with people by the time the problem is really severe. Nationally, that now means that on average 135 people a week are having feet or legs amputated that could have been saved if they'd been caught at an earlier stage. And so we looked as well, for instance, at bus services. We chose rural bus services in Shropshire. There was a wonderful service called The Link, which used to go around serving a whole lot of very remote Shropshire villages, and it went round several times a day and took them to Bridgnorth for doctor's appointments, to go to school, to work, visiting relatives, and to do their shopping, the only place they could do their shopping. The whole of the Link service has been cut because councils have had 40% cuts. They can't manage it any longer. There is now one bus once a week, driven by a volunteer, that stops for 1 hour at Bridgnorth, and that is the only contact for those 5,000 people who don't have cars. And again, these things are sort of invisible. They disappear. There's a bit of noise locally, a bit of fuss, but it's the shrinking back of things we regard as the essential fabric of the state that have always been there. How can it be this country is still, though slowly, getting richer every year, and yet our services are getting worse?
A lot of people who read the book will take those facts and then accept some of those opinions. But let me put a slightly different point of view. When I was a kid at school, one of our teachers said, "Do you know what the initials NHS stand for? What they stand for is admired around the world." Now, not a single country anywhere has followed us into that kind of system. And this is absolutely not about the people who work in the organisation, it's about the organisation itself. In other words, Tony Blair said, "I've got scars on my back from trying to reform public services." Some public services are not very well managed. And they're not very well managed because on the one side, the Conservatives say, oh, we better not really mess around too much with the NHS because Labour will make a great big case of it, and Labour don't do very much when they're in power. And the NHS is not as good in many, many ways, unfortunately, as the system in Germany or the system in Japan. And we constantly compare ourselves to the system in America, which is completely wrong comparison. I mean, that's one of the biggest parts of which the state has an impact in our life, and it surely needs a degree of reform, doesn't it?
Another reform?
A big reform.
Bigger than the Lansley reform?
Well,
another huge earthquake, volcanic reform?
Well, is the answer simply to throw money at it? I've just come back from a month in Germany. A German friend who works for a newspaper says, do you know, we don't write about the healthcare system in Germany. It just sort of works. We've got plenty of beds. We don't have a crisis over the winter. We find it extraordinary that you and I, in our newspapers and television, go on about it. They just don't get it. Why we have not got it right.
Because it's absolutely starved of funds. Not since 1948 has it had so little extra money given to it. By next year, it's getting a real reduction in per capita spending. I mean, let's go back to what you said about the NHS. I know you're being devil's advocate. The NHS is rated in the world by the Commonwealth Fund, which is an American think tank that rates all of the world's health systems. It has been rated consistently, not best for outcomes, but best for management, in that it provides more bang for the buck than any other system. The German and the French systems are very good, but they are very much more expensive, infinitely more bureaucratic, and have very many fewer spending controls. But they do spend hugely more than we do. We did finally, when the NHS was suffering one of its periodic moments of crisis through cuts, which happened in '98, when Labour had taken over and had promised to stick to the Tory spending plans, Blair was in a panic, and if you remember, was put on the spot in a television programme and said, I promise that we will bring the NHS spending up to EU spending levels. And it just about did. By the time we got to 2007, 2008, it hit those levels, at which point, you know, it's absolutely soared up in terms of its outcomes, in terms of, I mean, I'd always thought the natural rationing mechanism for the NHS had been the waiting list. Waiting lists were effectively abolished. Everybody was treated within 18 weeks. Before that, there had been 18-month waiting lists. The cancer times were brought down to, you know, the two-week measure, the 4-hour wait in A&E. Having covered the NHS ever since I wrote a book about it in 1975, I didn't think it could be done. But it does show that the NHS is very efficient, but frequently underfunded. And if we had always had the same level as France and Germany, I think we would be outstripping them by miles in terms of outcomes as well. And so I think there are lots of public services you can pick on to say could be much better managed. But the NHS is really one of the best managed systems. I'm all right, a million treatments every day. You can always going to find inefficiencies. Wherever you go at any time, you could always see ways things could be done better. People who work in the NHS are endlessly saying we could do it this way, we could do it that way. But as a system paid for by the taxpayer directly, it is much less bureaucratic, takes up much less administrative time than the German system, which is paid through a number of sort of guilds or trade unions, and it's quite complicated, the paper flow. But in the end, you don't pay for it, but the state pays for it, but through these complicated mechanisms. The French system has no real gatekeepers. It doesn't have GPs. You have to go through a GP to get to a consultant. You can go and see 2 or 3 consultants direct under the French system if you want, just because you feel like it, and that makes that very expensive. I think the NHS is, you know, by any objective standard, fantastically efficient and very good value for money, but in a desperate state at the moment, just because it's got less money relatively than ever before.
I want to come to audience questions in just a second. Just one final thought on that. The political rhetoric, though, of the past 30 years, which you touched on when you began talking about the size of the state, has broadly been that the private sector creates wealth and the public sector, state, you know, gold-plated pensions and all that sort of thing. Why is that rhetoric allowed to persist at a time when, if you ask people, what do you trust? It tends to be they trust school teachers, universities, actually, the NHS, doctors. Why is that?
It's been a campaign of vilification against anything public. After all, in this country, we have, unlike across most of Europe, not only 85% of our press right-wing, but very, very right-wing, and run by, you know, owned by very extreme, non-British tax-paying media barons. And they, you know, whether it's Murdoch or the Barclay brothers sitting in Sark, or the whole lot of them, or Lord Rothermere, who's a non-dom resident in France, they have an interest which is to shrink the state as small as you can possibly get it. I mean, Murdoch's animus against the state is quite phenomenal, and he owns 40% of the readership of our newspapers, and is about to take over the whole of Sky. And I think it's for them an ideological project, which was very much taken up by Thatcher, who used to have a battered old copy of Hayek in her handbag that she would wave. And she always used to say, you know, you will always spend the pound in your pocket much better than the state ever will. To which we would say no. We would say, if you look at the things you really value in life, whether it's your health, whether it's your children's education, whether it's security, safety, terrorism, or just everyday security, whether it's beautiful public spaces and fine buildings, parks, things that make us, all the things that make us proudest, whether it's the BBC, things that make us proudest of our country and things we care about most in our own lives, those are the things bought with the pounds we pay in tax. tax is the price we pay for civilization. And so a point of our book is to try to reverse that argument and say it's not so. It's also not true to say, in a simplistic way, business makes money, public services spend it. There is a symbiosis there that is really important to understand. I mean, businesses can only thrive where there is a strong, effective state, at the most basic level, where there is law that will protect their ownership, their rights, where there is a state that will educate, house, and look after their workforce. More than that, their research and development. Almost everything that they do relies on there being a very effective state. And on the whole, businesses will tend to deny this. They like the idea that there is, there are the makers and the spenders. But if you look at the support that they get from the state, you look at the enormous tax relief system, which is the sort of business welfare state that they rely on, that's very important too. So I think that we've got to sort of do away with the idea that the two don't equally need each other.
Just one quick question that came in an email, just to change the subject slightly, and then we'll go to, we've got microphones that'll come round in just a second. What's your most memorable or favourite news story? Was it, given what you just said, the day Mrs. Thatcher resigned?
Well, it was a wonderful moment, wasn't it? Who will ever forget John Sargent standing there with his microphone and behind him, look behind you! And there she was. It was an extraordinary moment. Yes, I'd certainly put that high on my list. But, I would also put 1997 high on my list. Moment of political euphoria, feeling, we've had such a long era of Conservative rule. Here is a whole new beginning. And you always know that new beginnings in politics are destined to be disappointing, because they always are. Nothing, politics is difficult and complicated, and you're never going to get the government of your dreams. Nevertheless, I think as far as socially and as far as politics at home were concerned, I think that government was pretty damn good and is being underestimated. Leave aside Iraq and other appalling errors. I don't think we should go on saying, everything the Blair government did was terrible, because actually it restored what had been years of real decline in the fabric, the social fabric of the state, and it put a lot of it back. But now we've seen how quickly it's been swept away, partly because the one thing, as you'd said, Labour failed to do was to change the politics, the nature of the politics, to make people understand they did good by stealth. So he would always say things like, scars on my back from reforming public services, to show he was being tough on the public sector, to justify spending that money, as opposed to saying the sorts of things we're saying in our book, which is celebrate this. This is who we are. This is good in itself. And he never dared do that. They always, after the 92, the disappointment of losing the 92 election, they always feared that they were only there for a short time. This was essentially a Conservative country. They would be out of office in no time. And they lived in a state of paranoia, really, and never dared to say, this is our moment to change the psyche of the country as well.
Let's have a look at the psyche of the audience, if we might. Can we turn up the lights a little bit?
Up.
And there we go. There's somebody there and the lady there. So whoever you get to first.
Polly, to get the kind of change that you talk about, it clearly needs a change of government, and presumably that would mean a Labour government for the future. The question I really want to ask is, how do you think Labour can build a kind of a platform to bridge between the metropolitan young Labour voters that we saw in the last general election, and to that, its traditional white working class vote in towns in the Midlands and the North? That seems to me a really, really difficult ask. I'd really like your views on that.
I think it's a real problem. I think that, however, what we discovered at the last election is the extent to which people are beginning to get it about austerity, about what a disaster it's been. It's beginning to touch people in ways that they can see. Perhaps at first couple of years, perhaps they didn't quite realise. I think now increasingly they are seeing the disadvantages for their children, the lack of housing, where on earth are they all going to live. They're looking at the large numbers of people who work in the public sector are telling them what's happening inside the NHS. For the first time, schools are having really severe cuts, so that when MPs, a lot of Tory MPs, were quite shocked during the last election, standing outside schools, as they do during elections, at parents coming out enraged, having heard that they were losing teachers and nearly all their teaching assistants over this summer. So when they go back to school next week, a lot of teachers will have gone. These things have come as a sort of real shock. And I think for the first time, what we saw and the big shift, unexpected success of Labour in the last election reflected this recognition. And given that the trajectory that was set by George Osborne is being followed by Philip Hammond in his first budget, right the way through to cut the size of the state down to a size it has never been for any length of time, to 35% of GDP. Our norm is around 43% of GDP. A relentless cutting is going to go on right through to 2022, unless they have, a sort of major change of heart. I think that it gets through to everyone. And I know that it was mostly older people who, if nobody had had the vote over 65, Labour would have won the election. Yes. There is, of course, mortality and new young voters coming up.
Looking on the bright side. There's a lady there and then there's another lady. But of course,
a lot of us older people are very good and very nice and not like that at all.
A very good lady over there.
NHS. When I was born in the 40s, the NHS was totally for the masses, for the very poor, for influenza, for basic, really dire illnesses. Now it's full of cosmetic inventions. People who have a flat chest can go and have an implant now. They're not happy with their body. Ears pinned back. It's cosmetic. A lot of it's cosmetic. It's so overloaded that it doesn't matter how much money you pour into it. It was never invented for that.
It's a tiny, tiny fraction. And mostly you can't get those things. They can't even get bariatric surgery now for people who are grossly overweight and are going to end up costing the NHS a lot more. It is really difficult. Go to your GP, ask if you can have your ears pinned back. I think he'll say you can't. Try and get... There are certain things that may look as if they're cosmetic, but now the rationing that's going on, the Guardian's been covering this a lot. And a lot of CCGs now will not commission anyone to have 2 cataracts, only 1, because they reckon you can see all right with 1 eye. Increasingly, hips and knees are no longer being, but that's really important because...
I know it's important, but it's just that it's so changed.
We can't hear you without the microphone on.
It's changed because it's true. Technology makes us able to save people we couldn't before, to save people in deep pain that we couldn't have helped before. And I've seen a lot of people, who are in wheelchairs waiting for a new hip and whose lives are transformed when they get one. Now, in the end, people who are in wheelchairs end up costing the state more. Actually, a hip operation is pretty cost effective in terms of the care that those people don't need. And now, increasingly, you find cost effectiveness is absolutely what's being followed through on all sorts of operations, are being cancelled, not being allowed to be done. The idea that you can just go in and get your breasts done, well, I don't think so.
Lady over there.
Hi, I don't normally need a microphone, but I'll use it to
it's just so you're recording it so we can all hear you.
And more of an observation, really, that it feels to me like this government has become they're so politicians rather than statesmen now that they are at a level of incompetence that we've never seen before. And they absolutely rely on sound bites and slogans, and they look quite panicked sometimes. We never hear anything real from them. Do you think they've actually reached the bottom?
I do hope so. I mean, I hope things can only get better, but I fear that things may get quite a lot worse before they get better. I think what's happened over Brexit, which we haven't mentioned, is that the capacity to do anything else at all. I mean, Whitehall has been cut by a third, and they tend to be the most senior, most experienced people that you really need in a crisis, who are the ones who've gone because they're most expensive. And they've been made redundant, pensioned off. I think that the government at the moment is more or less paralysed, unable to do anything else at all, that all the best brains have been taken out of other Whitehall departments to be put into the Brexit department. The empty international trade department, I wonder whether that'll ever be activated, but we shall see. And I think that there is a panic. I think you're right. I think there is a panic, even amongst those who were the Brexiters. I mean, I wonder whether David Davis really feels quite as cocky as he looks. I suspect not. I suspect that he has been shown things. He has been shown what's over the precipice. That you've only got to read the Financial Times to see day after day one sector after another coming forward of things we'd never thought about, never thought it would affect that sector in that way, this sector in this way, the sheer complexity. There are something like 759 different treaties that the EU has with 168 other countries for trading that we now need to replicate with those 168 other countries, and that's just on those trade deals. And you begin to see the full nightmare of what has to be done and how difficult it is. And if they're I hope they are panicking. But I think a lot of quite complicated ideas that they had of things they were going to do in other departments, you will not see any big major reforms, partly because they haven't got a majority any longer, or not much of a working majority. But I don't think you're going to see any big major structural reforms on any aspect of life at all. And, Brexit will go on and on and on and on. It's not going to be over quick.
Well, can I just pursue that point? Because I know it's of interest to a lot of people. I said I've just come back from Germany. One of my, a German doctor friend of mine said to me, he said, the way we see it here is you British had a headache, so you shot yourself in the foot. His German humour is pretty good, I should say. And he said, you still got the headache, but now you can't walk. Now, I'm not sure whether you should, but is it going to happen? And if so, what is it? That's, Brexit is Brexit, of course, doesn't really mean anything, but what is the it that's going to happen?
What is the it? I mean, there are so many different possible its, except that increasingly, as we're only just at the beginning stages of negotiations, Barnier keeps saying, but you're either in or you're not in. And it's becoming alarmingly clear that there aren't very many options. We can't sit there saying, we'll do this and this and this, and this is how we wish to shape it. I think, I hope for the maximum damage limitation. And the best we can hope for is as little damage as possible, it seems to me. I think all that airy stuff about, well, we're going to have these wonderful trade, we're going to be global Britain with trade agreements with Trump, with Modi in India, with tiny New Zealand, and that somehow this is going to compensate for virtually half our trade with Europe. It is just sort of vanishing into the sea mist. And we are left with damage limitation. I think the best damage limitation I can see, where it's still Brexit, is to stay in the EEA, to stay in the single market, to stay in the customs union. It means we have to pay, and it means we have to obey the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, and we have to accept free movement. And we have no vote. We have no MEPs, and no vote or no say. We are like Norway and Switzerland and Liechtenstein and Iceland. And I think that's the least damaging. And maybe at some point in the future, some other government comes in that says, you know what, why don't we decide we do want our vote back in again and see if they'll take us back in again. But I mean, the hard truth is that there is not. I talk to pollsters all the time, all of us desperately looking for a glimmer of light. There is not much sign that many people have changed their minds as yet. Perhaps because nothing much has happened yet. All right, people have been on holiday. They've had to spend a lot more than they thought. But it still doesn't seem to have caused a serious change, because this was a gut, visceral vote where people felt it was about themselves, their identity, about Britishness. And I think it'll be quite a long time and quite difficult for people to say we were wrong or we were lied to, which is more to the point. You know, it wasn't true what they promised us. It's not available. They said we could have our cake and eat it. We've got no cake. And so there's a danger that those of us who were against Brexit live in a bit of an echo chamber. And if you're on Twitter and things, you're all listening to each other and encouraging each other to think that somehow everybody's going to change their mind quickly. And I fear that may not be the case. That's why I'm hoping some sort of compromise, technically Brexit, but not to Brexit, is the best we can hope for the moment.
Some more thoughts? Yes, lady at the back, just let us get the microphone to you. And
I can see you.
Originally, back in the day, I voted for the country to join the EU. And I was only young then, and I thought about it long and hard. And I decided then to vote yes, because I thought it was good for our agriculture, for our farmers, and for our trade. If I thought then that we would end up where we are now, with the EU as it is, and Barnier and the rest of them wanting a united sort of army of Europe, when I've stood in harbours and spoken to fishermen who have said all these boats are going to have to be burnt because of EU regulation, where a month ago, one of the Italian commissioners said, Britain should be more like the rest of us Europeans. We pick and choose what we want to implement. We don't take it as law written in stone. So, but you Brits, you play by the rules. And this is what you get. We've had nobody over the years, including Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, any of the others, all the treaties that have been signed that we've hardly heard anything about really, or not even explained, like Maastricht and all the rest of them. And we end up here. And I voted Brexit, and I know it's not perfect, but I'll be damned if I'll be run by those bureaucrats in Europe. Sod them is what I say.
Well, there you have it, you see. I mean, it is this is deep within us, and it's a deep divide. And one of the things I hate about referendums is that it does this yes or no. It divides people in a way that general elections don't. And I feel we have become a deeply divided country, and I don't think it's going to be easy for us to get together again and agree on this, because they are two very different views of the world. I mean, I hope it's not going to be too bad, is all I can say. I'm pessimistic, but, you know, obviously there was a majority of people who feel like you. It is very complicated. What's incredibly complicated, and every day turns out to be more and more complex, as you say, whether it's the treaties, we
can't hear you if we haven't got a microphone. I'm sorry, it doesn't quite work.
No, people have different reasons for it, but they are emotional reasons on both sides. Oh, no, I'm not saying one side's rational, the other's emotional. I think both sides are very emotionally divided on this. And who knows how it's going to be resolved, but I think the country is in a worse state as a result of this than at any time I can think of.
The lady there, yes, go ahead.
Sorry, this goes right back to the very beginning of that lady's point at the back. I didn't vote in when we joined the European Union because I was 7. So I'm in a kind of different position, but my daughter is a nutritional scientist. And one of her biggest problems is one of the major things that we're being told all the time, and I personally have heard this so often from people, starts with fishing, starts with our rights to fish from our island. There aren't any fish. And the fish that there are so horrifically polluted by plastic that by 2050 there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. The EU is the only way that we can keep our seas clean. And fishing rights...
Okay. I know you're not a great expert in fishing, but let me just put on this wider point, actually, about our political discourse, because I think that's very interesting. I said at the start, you know, you're a much-loved columnist, but not by everybody.
Just read the comments. No, don't read the comments.
No, don't read the comments. But a couple of questions on that. Somebody said, has Twitter helped or harmed political discourse in this country? I don't know.
I think it's very difficult to know. I mean, we're now so used to the internet, we can't quite imagine how communication would be without it. I think I like Twitter. I think it's because you do choose your community. You choose the people you want to follow, the people who are interesting. As a way of disseminating information, I find it terrific. I follow people who are going to draw my attention to things I didn't know. They're going to say, have you read this today? Look. And then there'll be a link, and you'll go and look at something I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And people who follow me, I will be doing the same. I'll be saying, look, I've found this, or look at this, this is interesting. And so if you have a community of that kind, I think it's positive and good. But then on the other hand, you look at the appalling malice and spite and poison that gets spilled out as well. I mean, at least with Twitter, you can knock it out.
It's very often, it's directed to lots of people, but it's very much worse for women in public life. When I talk to MPs, as you do, of all parties, and women MPs get the most despicable stuff.
We've done quite a lot of surveys of the comments that we get on The Guardian. When Kath Viner took over as first woman editor, she wanted to see, and there is no doubt at all that the bile that women writers on The Guardian get, and particularly ethnic minority writers on The Guardian get, absolutely exceeds anything that the men get. I mean, if you look at what Simon Jenkins gets compared to what I get, there's just no comparison if you look at the threads under our columns. And, you know, that is a problem. But you have to just develop a thick skin. You can retaliate sometimes if you really want to. But in the end, the price of having a public platform, which is an incredible privilege, is that you just have to be tough enough to ignore it. Not all of it. Sometimes, you know, some criticism is very good. Sometimes people will write things under my column saying, you obviously didn't know X, Y, and Z. And I'll think, oh, I didn't. That's interesting. But most of it's not like that.
This is another question that was sent in by email. In what ways do you think journalism has changed over the course of your career? I mean, you've been doing it for quite a long time. How is it now? What's the health of it, or otherwise?
I think the very best of journalism now is absolutely as good or better than it's ever been. I think that the scale of investigative reporting, I mean, obviously, particularly on The Guardian, where we do major investigations, but also other newspapers do. The Times does it. You know, the FT has fantastic reporting. The ability to report and to find out information has got better, if anything. And so that's great. I think BBC serious investigations are fantastic. So the very best is there. But I think the general tone and tenor has been so debased since I started out in journalism. And I would say, I would pretty much date it from the day that Rupert Murdoch arrived on these shores. I think from the day that he took over The Sun and decided that anything goes, inevitably everybody had to follow him down. And even serious newspapers, if you look at them now, are to some extent having to deal with more gossip and rumour and that kind of thing than they did before. But I think with the arrival of the internet, perhaps that would have happened anyway.
again, to play devil's advocate, the stuff you talked about, which is the good stuff, is very expensive. It costs the Guardian or the BBC or the Times or anybody a lot of money to investigate something, because somebody does not turn in any work for 3 months or 6 months or a year. That's the expensive stuff, and the other stuff sells. It does sell. You know, there's a lot of stuff that you see on the internet. There's a certain sidebar of shame on a well-known popular newspaper, which I won't mention, which is very popular. Very popular.
Yep. No,
So
I mean,
that's where
the
the money is.
sidebar of shame, of course, sells all over the world. And it's full of nothing but starlets and their goings on, and it's, you know, it's sort of Hello Magazine times 100, and so the Daily Mail makes a lot of money out of that. It's true. Journalism is unbelievably expensive. There are serious investigations. We did the Panama Papers about the tax scams. That took about 5 journalists about 6 months of doing what journalists don't expect to do. They became accountants. They sat in a room, hermetically sealed, going through all of these documents in great detail, taught by accountants sort of how to do it. That is a phenomenally expensive operation, to have senior journalists doing that, to produce effectively one story. It was a very powerful story. It had a lot of impact, and it's had quite a lot of impact on legislation and on HMRC chasing up on people who were cheating through using offshore tax havens. Our foreign reporting is, as you know, having been a foreign correspondent, is very expensive. It's the most expensive thing the BBC does. And yet having really good correspondence on the spot all over the world is what makes a newspaper serious. And nobody knows now how we are going to pay for serious journalism. How do you get people to pay for it? People have been used to having newspapers very cheap and news very cheap. And it's very difficult because the advertising paid for it. We began to be making money out of online advertising, and about 2.5 years ago, Google and Facebook, this is true of all newspapers, not just The Guardian, about 2.5 years ago, the Google and Facebook moved in and swept up most of newspapers' online advertising, because they could offer things that newspapers can't. You know, the Times can say, we can give you Times readers, here they are, or we can say, give you Guardian readers. If you're Google and Facebook, you can say, do you want people who own lawnmowers in Deal? We'll give you those people. They know everything about everyone, and they can segment down to a level where it becomes very good targeted advertising. And it's quite hard for us to compete with that.
It's actually quite terrifying, because I don't know who it is in my family is responsible for this, but when I go on Google, I get things for chicken coops. It's not me. Anyway, just a couple more questions, if I may. Right, this one we've avoided.
When you
all
have
night.
your 60th birthday, you'll start getting deep heat. No, the birthday goes.
Well, there's that
deep
to you
heat.
look forward to. And Donald Trump, discuss. I'm going to sit. Actually, I'm going to take a break. I'll be back in. No. What can one say that has not been said? I mean, there's investigative journalism. There's what we know, the facts. There's what impact it made, which is not much. In other words, people knew what they were getting and they went for it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think that we're beginning to realise that politics is so much more about telling stories and who tells the best story. And it almost doesn't matter if the story is true. Facts, figures, statistics. And on the whole, people on the liberal left side of politics tend to deal in facts and figures and think that that will do. And on the whole, it's been proved increasingly, I think, that people who tell stories, you know, Reagan was brilliant at this. He never facted his figure, he didn't know anything, but he did know how to tell stories. And this emotional connection with voters has become even more important, I think. And Trump has shown that total disregard for facts, total disregard for what he said himself, so that when people then say, here's a clip, you said this 3 days ago, he'll say, no, I didn't. And somehow gets away with it. Because people have decided to, who like him, to identify with him. He stands for me. He stands for people like me. He says he'll stand up for people like me, so I'm with him. And anybody who wants to trash him, well, they can. And as for, well, a few minor inaccuracies here and there, who cares? You know, is that important? Not as important as I feel this guy is on my side. And it's that being on your side-ness that is the key to winning. And he's just taken it to the nth degree.
Do you think he's affected politics outside his country? In other words, where, you know, he's the word populist comes up quite a lot. You can define it in different ways. But the fact that he produced a critique of the American system, which a lot of people agreed with, used the word it's rigged against people. And Bernie Sanders on the left of politics used the same word. So that really struck a chord. He's in the business of government now, which is a very, very different thing. And as you know, it's a much more difficult, whatever we think of politicians, and you know, you've had a go at some of them, but it's actually quite a tricky job, isn't it?
Well, he's going to run up against himself. I mean, he's in this peculiar position where a lot of his party are trying to stop him doing the things that he got elected saying he would do, partly because some of them are impossible or dangerous, this can't be done. So that he may well find himself able to win again by saying, I've been betrayed. And what's more, I've even been betrayed by Republicans. They keep blocking me and stopping me doing the things that I know all of you people want me to do. So it seems to me not impossible that he could pull it off a second time. But who knows? I am no longer in the prediction business. That's for sure. I no longer know anything at all about what's going to happen next. That's the one thing I've learned about the last couple of years. I know nothing about the future. I can look at the past and I can look at patterns and I can say things like, well, in the past it tends to be X and Y, but it does not predict the future any longer. I mean, don't you feel the same?
I do. In fact, I've just been rereading a wonderful story by Washington Irving called Rip Van Winkle. And Rip Van Winkle, I don't know if any of you have ever read it, but he in the story, he fell asleep in the British colonies in North America. And he woke up and there was some guy called George Washington running everything. And I feel that maybe wake me up when it's all over. I don't know.
On the other hand, I think one of the effects of Trump has been to quite frighten Europeans, in that if you think a short time ago we were terrified that Marine Le Pen, that Geert Wilders, the Alternative for Germany, that UKIP here, they are actually now in retreat. They have not done well. You know, a year ago we were pretty damn frightened that sort of that kind of Trumpism was going to sweep across Europe. And so far, it hasn't happened.
To go back to the media point, and we've got time for just a couple more questions on that from the floor, if there are any. But one of the things that played into his victory was the rise of what people, I think, rather politely call the alt-right media. Which is pretty wacky if you've read it. I'm, again, being polite, I could say some other things. But what is the attraction of that, do you think? And does that, perhaps, whatever you may think of Rupert Murdoch and The Sun, there are editors who can get fired, but there's a lot of stuff out there, you've got no idea where it's coming from. And indeed, it may be coming from some of our good friends in Moscow, for all we know.
Indeed, it does. Or in Macedonia, there are these groups of people who are making quite a lot of money by putting it out and doing it actually less for ideological reasons and because they can make a lot of money by getting a lot of clicks on entirely false stories, which tend to be of the right. I think that's quite frightening, that it's becoming harder and harder for people to tell where anything has come from. And then things get repeated, often by mistake, by credible sources, so that on Facebook, somebody in a group of Facebook friends picks up something and then passes it round, and other people say, well, that comes from someone I know. And so a kind of credibility gets attached to entirely monstrously wrong stories. I think the whole of the alt-right system, again, is a system of belief. It's a kind of religion. I belong to this group. These are my people. They're telling me this stuff, and I choose to believe it. And if somebody tells you, look, I can prove to you it's not true, this didn't happen, it's not so. Obama, was born in America, whatever it might be. it's a matter of, it's like those great big American churches where preachers can get up and say anything and people will choose to believe it because they feel good believing it, wherever it might be. Pay lots of money into me and you will become rich yourself because I will tell God to make you rich, whatever it might be. I mean, there is a lot of craziness around, and there's always been more craziness in America than anywhere else.
Also more creativity, I should say.
And also more creativity.
The half a dozen biggest enterprises that have changed our lives in the last 20 years.
Yep.
Facebook, Apple, Google,
Yep.
Twitter,
Yep.
they're all American.
Yep.
All American.
Yep, absolutely. And why not European? That's a worry for Europe, that Europe is not a powerhouse of that kind of creativity. But with it seems to go, Wild West other stuff too.
Any more thoughts from the floor? We're coming near to an end. Yes, gentleman there. And there's a gentleman at the front who's been trying to get into.
Polly, you made the point about the right, actually internationally, making those sort of emotional values connections, quite often appealing to sort of base instincts that, people have. But the left can do that, surely, in terms of that emotional values connections about society, about, they're trying to do preach about it, brotherhood as well, So, I mean, Owen Jones, one of your Guardian colleagues, says some very interesting things about that. I'd like your views on that, please, Polly.
You're right, and to some extent, our book is trying to play into that. It's trying to say, here are other stories. Here's another way of looking at things. Here's a way of being proud of what the state does, proud of what we do collectively as a society, feeling more sense of identity about that. We're only writers, we're not politicians, and that's the message that we want, and we want to offer material, if you like. It's not just material about everything that's going wrong and all the cuts and how bad things are, but also that memory of the things that we prize most and we value most. And those are stories that, left and liberals and people on the left of centre of all shades and degrees. I think Owen Jones is very good at doing it. He's a good emotional connector. We need more of those skills. We tend to have been very evidence-based, and I'm all for evidence. I mean, I always feel you need lots of facts to back up what you're saying emotionally. But along with that does need to come the storytelling ability. And I do think that the generation, the sort of Blair politician generation, arrived with an entirely evidence frame of mind. I mean, it was very exciting. In the first years of 97, meeting all the new young ministers taking over, they were terribly excited by evidence. They said, bring me facts. Tell me what works. I want to do, I want to do policies that work. And they collected lots of evidence, and they had 18 task forces on causes and effects of poverty, whether it was people getting into debt or addictions or whatever. We're going to solve each of those problems. They thought things could be scientifically dealt with and proven, but they forgot to make that emotional connection that would make everybody understand what they were doing, why it was good, and why it was for the collective good of society as a whole. And they were a bit technocratic, I suppose. Very well-intentioned, but a bit technocratic. And I'm not sure that we have a generation at the moment of politicians, on either right or left, that are very good at this storytelling and this emotional connection with people. And it does make people very vulnerable to anyone who suddenly comes along, any demagogue anywhere, who has the knack.
Gentleman here.
Thank you. Polly, could I ask you to reflect on your involvement with the SDP?
Yes, happily. SDP, for those of you too young to remember, a long time ago, formed in 1981 when Thatcher was at her lowest ebb and the country was in an appalling state, projected into a dreadful recession by her cuts. Labour was led by Michael Foot, who was profoundly unpopular and looked entirely unelectable, and he proved to be. And the fear was that The left would never get back in any shape or form, and it would be a good idea to fill the huge vacuum in the middle, not that we were in the middle, with a new party. And if I look back at the SDP manifesto, it was very radical indeed. It was far more radical than any of Blair's manifestos, and actually it was probably about as radical as Labour's was this time. So it's not that we were centrists in that sense. It was absolutely doomed to failure, and anybody else who tries it will fail as well, for the same reason that for as long as we have the electoral system we have, it will kill newcomers, whether of the right or the left. Ask UKIP what happened to them, 15% of the vote, sometimes more, not a single seat. We have an utterly unjust electoral system that paralyses our politics. I'm not surprised people feel alienated and distant from it. Nobody can get up with a good new idea and say, look, I want to start something else, whether of the right or of the left. It's just a dead hand that there are only two parties that can govern. Maybe sometimes they'll have to govern with somebody else. And if you want to change anything, the only hope is to capture one of those parties and shift it the direction you want it to go, which is a Herculean task. And, let's hope someday we will get proportional representation. Blair wanted to do it, lost his nerve when faced with some of the dinosaurs, although people like Jack Straw and Prescott and others absolutely wouldn't have it. And he thought it was a fight, he'd had enough fights with the Labour Party, it was a fight too far. But that would have made a more profound change to our politics than anything else he ever did, if only he'd done it.
Just a final question to send us off home happy, obviously.
Obviously.
Tell us something to cheer us up, for goodness sake. I'm not reflecting on you or your analysis or this evening, which has been great, but I need hardly remind you that there's a person in North Korea who may be firing a rocket over Japan as I speak. There's a person on a golf course somewhere in the United States who may wish to respond. Our own politics is deeply divided. The question of rich and poor that you touched on repeatedly in all your work and all your life is very much still with us. Tell us something that we should go home with a song in our hearts.
Well, I think that the mood is changing in this country, and I think we saw it, the shift beginning to happen in the last election. I think Labour's manifesto was excellent and touched a lot of people, and people thought, yeah, look at the appalling state of our trains. Not the train to here, which is brilliant, but look at the appalling state.
Oh, you're causing trouble now. There may be people who have a different view.
The appalling state of our trains. I've been travelling to Wales, and I've been travelling recently, but trying to get to Aberystwyth and trying to get to Huddersfield on small local train services, which are abominable. And, I wonder why commuters aren't up in arms in rebellion against the rail service. It doesn't surprise me that rail renationalisation is very popular indeed, right across the political spectrum. Lots of Tory voters very much in favour of it too. So that's a shift in attitude, I think, is happening. I think there is a shift in attitude too about how we treat people who are very poor or disabled. I think the sort of empathy pendulum is swinging back. It usually happens. British Social Attitudes, which has been asking people the same questions since the early 80s, monitors, and it usually finds that when the Tories have been in power for a long time and been very tough on benefits and very harsh on people and on services, that the pendulum begins to swing the other way. And that's what we are now seeing in the latest British Social Attitude surveys. When Labour's been in for a long time, they think, oh, they're giving lots of money to loads of slackers, and it begins to swing back the other way. So I think we are on a trajectory towards a better politics at the next election. And as long as Brexit doesn't do us too much economic damage, so that everybody is hit really hard. Let's hope that doesn't happen and that we can get through it reasonably smoothly. Then I can see a chance of Labour winning. It might be Labour and SNP and Liberal Democrats and Greens, I can see a possibility of a better government with a better future.
We'll have you back to discuss that when it happens. I've got a lot of thanks I want to say to people tonight. I hope we can come back here sometime soon. I'd like to thank James Tillett for organising it and inviting us today. I'd like to thank all the University of Kent staff and those working for us around us, particularly also Tim Farron and Lorna Parrott who organised this. I'd like to thank all of you for coming along because you are the greatest audience that there's ever been. I'm learning how to speak the lingo. And finally, of course, to thank Polly. And I know James has got a little present for her from all of us.
And thank you too.
Oh, thank you.